Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasegawa, and this is episode 48. Today's guest is Celeste Ng. Well, hello out there in podcast land. How are you all doing today? So, this afternoon I was reading Brandon Taylor's latest Tiny Letter. Those of you who are regular listeners will recall that Brandon was my guest on episode 38. Brandon is great, and his Tiny Letter is great, and if you're not reading it, I do highly recommend it. In fact, I'm going to put a link in the show notes so you can read this particular one, and then you can also sign up to subscribe. Anyway, so in this latest letter, Brandon was writing about prose styles and about Edith Wharton and about how her writing was different from what's currently in vogue. And that got me thinking about my own writing. And even more than that, this certain resistance that I have towards making new work. So I've been thinking about this short story idea for a while now, maybe a month or two, and I have it more or less figured out. I know who the characters are and what the plot is, and I even know, what themes I want to explore, what all that stuff is. I've known all of that for weeks at this point. I even know several of the scenes that I want to write, but instead of sitting down and actually writing it, I just keep thinking about what I want it to be instead, right? Like, there's this very particular anxiety that I actually think a lot of creative people deal with. At least I know from talking with other artists that I'm not alone in this, but it's this certainty that the thing I want to make and the thing that I actually do end up making, they're not going to be the same thing. And that what I made is never actually going to measure up to the thing that I first imagined. At least it never has so far. But that's the thing, right? Like, the unwritten story or the unshot photograph or whatever, as long as it stays unmade, it never has to be sullied by the fact of its execution. And, for me at least, everything I've ever done as an artist has wound up feeling like a failure by the time I was done with it. Most of the time, I come around again once I have a little distance from the work. And sometimes, even though it wasn't what I originally wanted, I find that it's something else that's valuable in a way that I hadn't expected. And even if it's not, eventually I'm always glad that I did it, even just for having gotten it out of my head. And you would think that at this point, having written hundreds of essays and shot thousands of photographs, that I would know that this reluctance to move past this potential but perfect stage and onto the flawed but finished stage, that this is just sort of part of the process, and that it wouldn't be so hard. But more and more, what I'm realizing is that you never really get past your resistances and your anxieties. Rather, if you're going to maintain a lifelong artistic practice, what you do is figure out strategies to just reduce the amount of time that you spend in these early stages. I think that's really the best that you can hope for. Which, I don't know, I guess that might sound a little discouraging, especially if you're just getting started. I think maybe if someone had told me that when I was first getting started, I don't know, might have found that discouraging. But honestly, I think it's kind of liberating. At least that's where I am right now, Anyway, I'd love to hear how you deal with artistic resistance, so hit me up on Twitter @ChannelOpenPod. Okay, so as I mentioned, today's guest is Celeste Ng. Celeste is a writer based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I am super excited to have gotten the chance to talk with her because her debut novel, Everything I Never Told You, kind of changed my life. That book came out in 2014, and I read it last summer. That would have been 2016 if you're listening to this far down the line. And, it was just amazing, and you'll hear me gush about it a little bit or maybe a lot during the conversation. And now Celeste is back with a brand new novel called Little Fires Everywhere, which if you're listening to this the day the episode airs, the book just came out yesterday, and I got a chance to read it ahead of time, and I can safely give it my highest recommendation. She really knocked it out of the park here. So I wanted to do something a little fun and special this time around because I love these books so much. So I'm going to do a little giveaway. I'll be doing a drawing to give away a trade paperback edition of Everything I Never Told You, along with a signed hardcover edition of Little Fires Everywhere. So stick around after the conversation for details on that. Also, Celeste is doing a huge 27-city tour for her new book, and I will also be sharing some details on that at the end of the show, so make sure and stick around for that as well. Okay, let's get to it. If you've got questions or comments as you're listening, use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod on Twitter to join in the conversation. And now, here's my conversation with Celeste Ng. So how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm getting through.
Good might be an overstatement. Yesterday I feel was a bad news day, and it's just been kind of a bad news past 7 months to a year. So I feel like this is I've never had to put such a disclaimer on when I send someone an email saying, I hope you're well. And then I always want to add in, given the deteriorating state of our democracy and nation.
Yeah.
I feel like now it's almost like a given, like with everything considered, how are you?
Yeah, it's the 2017 footnote. Oh my God.
Yeah, I feel like it's a year where a lot of people, myself included, have had to do a lot of sort of reckoning with okay, what do I actually believe in and what am I going to do about it? Mm-hmm. Right. It's this sort of moment where I feel like it's like, you have to decide at what point you're going to put your actual beliefs into action. And I've been really happy to find that for a lot of people, that's now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the only things that's sort of, I shouldn't say one of the only things, but it is one of the things that's kind of pulling me through is seeing how many people are, stepping up and actually sort of, taking responsibility and exercising their rights and voices,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that people I feel like are trying to help, which is good. So, yeah. Which is pretty much all we can do is try to help. So,
yeah. So, I'll say too, another thing that's pulling me through these days is art, obviously art and literature, and I guess that is maybe not the smoothest segue, but I wanted to say I think I've said this to you online before, but I wanted to say it with my voice as well, that I really love both of your books, and so I think I read Everything I Never Told You early last year, and I think I can pretty comfortably say that turned out to be one of the most important books of my whole life. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That is probably the nicest thing that any writer could hope to hear. So thank you.
Yeah. And so for the listeners, this is, well, actually, could you intro the story a little bit?
Sure. So my first novel, Everything I Never Told You, takes place in a small Ohio town in the 70s. And when the book opens, it's looking at a mixed race family where the father is a Chinese American and the mother is a white woman. And they have 3 mixed race children. And as the book opens, the middle child, Lydia, who is the favorite of the family, is not in her bed, and it soon turns out that she's drowned in the lake nearby. And this is not much of a spoiler because you literally find that out in the first sentence of the book, sort of what's happened to her. And the novel looks at sort of all of the kind of family secrets and emotional entanglements that led up to this, and then also at how the family tries to survive this. That's sort of one of the main questions of the book is sort of how do you deal with grief? How do you get to that place? And then how do you kind of try and work through it?
Yeah. One of the things that when I say that it was one of the most important books of my life, so I was 36. I hadn't quite had my 37th birthday yet when I read it. When I read this book, and that as far as I can remember, this is sort of the first time in my whole life that I actually saw certain aspects of my life represented in literature. And that was not something that I would not have expected that to hit me as hard as it did, but it really, really did. And I don't know that, I mean, I think maybe before that I had, because the conversations I'd had and read and seen around representation in art and in culture, certainly resonated with me, but I was still sort of surprised at just how powerful and necessary that felt to me. I guess I'd sort of gotten to the point where I didn't really, having been so used to not having that experience, I kind of felt like I didn't really need it. And then when it happened, it was like, oh my God.
I know just what you mean, because I think, we get used to it. Oh, okay, this is how it is. This is what there is for me. And that's what I'm going to learn to get by with that. I mean, I've had experiences like that myself with, even as recently as when Fresh Off the Boat came on the air, I knew it was coming. I was kind of intellectually excited about it. And I was like, yeah, that's great. This is going to be, the second show that we've ever had featuring an Asian American family, the first being All American Girl, which was for one, year in the mid 90s. And I thought, okay, that's great. That's great. I'm really happy. And then when the show actually came on and I started watching it, I had this experience, sort of like what you're saying, that I didn't realize how big an emotional and psychological impact that would have on me, to be able to see a family that looked something like mine on the screen, that acted something like mine, and then also to be able to see many other people. I was watching it and sort of tweeting out bits of it online, and other people were doing the same thing. To have so many people kind of going, oh, this is something that we haven't seen. I didn't realize that I was missing that until I saw it, and it's not exactly my experience, but just the idea that there could be a show that featured people that look something like me was much more powerful than I expected. I mean, similarly, such a small thing, but the fact that, when Hamilton became a big thing, that one of the lead actresses, Philippa Sue, is part Asian. For some reason, that is a really, huge emotional touch point for me. And I think it has to do with what you're saying, of that it's almost like you didn't realize how thirsty you were for that until you actually get to experience it.
Yeah. And Hamilton, I know you love that show at least as much as I do.
Well, I may have talked about it once or twice on Twitter. Yeah. Maybe 3 or 87 times.
It's just such that is another thing, just the being able to see the insertion of people of color into such an American story. Oh man, it was just such a revelatory experience. Not to mention such catchy music.
Yeah, it's a great show in and of itself. Objectively speaking, the music and the lyrics and all of that. And then when you add in all the other layers of, being able to sort of overlay that sort of American story, which, is a lot of dead white men, to overlay it with a lot of the concerns that we're having now and concerns of people of color, and to talk about sort of the race-informed casting and all of the musical influences, all the layers upon layers. It's well, this is why Lin-Manuel Miranda got his Genius Grant, and this is why that show has become such a huge hit, and rightly so.
Yeah. Yeah. And sort of tying this back to Everything I Never Told You, I think, there's something about the specific thing that really resonated me so much with the character of James is how American he is. He's Chinese by descent, but culturally he's just really, really American, and that is something that he always has to sort of fight for throughout his life.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself as I was reading this, this is something that I know really, really intimately from my own experience, and how valuable that is for me to see that reflected in fiction finally. But also how, somebody who didn't grow up the way that I grew up, that, his character, all of the characters, I mean, I think this is sort of a theme, not a theme, but like it's common throughout all of your writing is that, you write all of your characters with such sensitivity, and with, like, I feel like every character in both of your books, there's an opportunity for the reader to connect with them very deeply because you write them very sympathetically, even when they're kind of, doing unsympathetic things. And it seemed to me like there was this opportunity maybe for, people who didn't have that life experience to sort of vicariously experience and understand it through characters like James. And that, like, I don't think anybody really sets out with a piece of art necessarily in order to have it be educational exactly, but like it can function that way, and that still seems like it's a really valuable aspect of it. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I'm really glad to hear you say what you just said, that, there's an opportunity to understand why a character is doing what that character is doing, or why they are the way they are, or how they've become to be that person, even when they're doing things that you don't like or that you disapprove of or that you would never do yourself. I certainly didn't set out to do it that way, but I think that that's kind of how I try to approach people in real life, I guess, is just sort of that there's a reason that they are how they are. And, it's very, very, very rare that you find someone who's, an actual villain outside of like a Disney movie. And even then, right? Like there's usually like, oh, they had this traumatic, childhood or whatever. But you think about like, if someone's acting like a villain, there's a villain in the story and there's a hero. A lot of times those roles are a lot more blended than we would think they are. And not to make everything about Hamilton, but I like, one of the things that Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing in that is he's playing with this idea that, Aaron Burr is the villain, that he just came and he shot Hamilton and that was the end, and he destroyed, one of the brightest minds of the revolution. And yet it's much more complicated than that. And when we can kind of see all of the things that go into forming that relationship and forming both of those people, I feel like that actually is kind of what literature is about, and also what art is about. It's just, you're not there to make a moral judgment, but you're there to at least try and understand why someone else is doing the things that they're doing.
Yeah.
And I never have been successful in writing a work where I come to it with like a didactic agenda. But if there's an agenda in my work, it's largely, to kind of undercut that idea that they're villains. There might be misguided people, or there might be people who are making bad decisions, but there's usually a reason for it. It's maybe not an excuse, but it's a reason. We can understand it. And I feel like if we don't do that, then we're kind of missing out on a lot of opportunities to reach that person and to kind of, reach some kind of understanding with them.
Yeah. It's funny, as you're talking about, not making this all about Hamilton, but, thinking about how the arc of that show progresses, especially with respect to Burr, how, he starts off so buttoned up and not exactly an antagonist because they're friends in the beginning, but there's this sort of sense of disconnect between the two of them at the beginning. He
won't join in the rap battle, right?
Yeah.
Like he won't. They invite him in, and he says no, right? Like, I'm gonna sit this out. You do what you're gonna do, and I'll sit, right? And he won't. He's holding himself apart in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah. So he's not in opposition to them yet, but he's not with them either.
Right. And then eventually you get songs like Wait for It and Dear Theodosia, where you see a little more inside. And then by the end of it, you see this in the beginning. Actually, now that I think of it, in both of your books, I had a comparison as I was reading them to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, how a lot of times he'll in the beginning of his books, say what the end is in like the first page.
Right, right.
And
you're facing the firing squad right in the first sentence of it.
Right. And that also happens in your books as well. And I was actually thinking about it, this also happens in Hamilton. You know what's going to happen at the end, right at the beginning. But the trick of it all and the amazing thing is that seeing it happen and watching it unfold, as you see everyone's motivations, it becomes like it carries a sense of inevitability, like it could only have ever turned out this way.
Right.
And that's true in your books as well, I feel like, where understanding each one of these characters so intimately and understanding where each one is coming from gives you this opportunity that when you see them sort of collide in this way, it could by the time you get to the end, it just feels like this is the only way it could have turned out,
Yeah, that's a really flattering thing to say. Thank you. I mean, I like that idea. I didn't plan it that way when I started out either of these books, to sort of like put the big reveal up front. But I guess the comparison that I'm thinking of is I was at the library the other day, and they had a high school student who was there setting up this giant Dominoes display in the meeting room. So they were going over the table and under the chairs and around, and it, you could come back at 5 o'clock and he was going to tip it all over. And I was thinking that in some ways that's almost the experience that I want the reader to have in this book, which is that if you watch him setting up those dominoes, you know what's going to happen when he tips over that domino, right? You can see the path. You can follow the line of how they're all going to fall down. And yet the experience of watching all of that actually happen and watching all those dominoes come down is still really pleasurable and enjoyable and just fun. And so in some ways, that's almost the experience that I want the reader to have, which is that you know where that's going. You know that this is how it's going to turn out, but yet watching that actually come out is still going to give you something. It's still going to be something that you want to sort of watch and participate in.
Yeah. So, I could probably keep talking about your first book forever, but I also, obviously, I want to talk about your new one, which I was so thrilled to get a chance to read ahead of time, and I just thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
First off, and it's always interesting too, like when you read someone's first novel and it leaves an impression on you, and then when the next one comes out, you're kind of wondering, especially if it's if a lot of fantasy and science fiction writers will write a long series, and that's sort of different, but
right.
When you're coming at an entirely new story, you always sort of wonder what it's going to feel like, and I think it's really interesting when you can. With any artist in any discipline, whether it's literary or visual or whatever, how oftentimes you can sort of trace, like each work will feel a thing unto itself, but also sort of part of a progression and part of it's still the same person making it, and there's like a definite voice to it. I love being able to see that,
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I know what you mean, because especially I think this is a place where the comparison to art, I think, is really sort of useful, which is that, each thing that an artist might make is probably going to be vastly different from the thing before, right? But you start to see certain common concerns that link all of those things together, right? Or there are certain things that they're working with, or they're playing with, and there are certain things that they keep coming back to and approaching from different ways. And, I think that's true of writers too, except that with writers, the subject is always so much up at the front that a lot of times we're like, oh, good, you're writing another book about, wishes, or you're writing another book about like Russia, or you're writing another book about, whatever it is that you're writing about. And the sophomore novel thing I'm realizing is a real, a real thing, not just something that people talk about like, oh yeah, sophomore novels are hard, but because you're adding another data point, I guess, to sort of what people are going to think about you. People might read my first book and think, okay, so she's going to write about these kinds of subjects. She's going to write about race or family or like, being interracial relationships or whatever there is. And then the second book is either going to line up with what they thought or it's going to subvert it in some ways. But either way, it's going to get measured against that first book.
Yeah.
And so it's a tricky thing to, I tried not to think about that too hard while I was writing the second book, but of course it's there in the back of my mind. So, I'm hopeful that people will see some of the common themes that I myself am only now starting to figure out as I've written the second book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because, like, it's funny, as I was reading Little Fires Everywhere, I thought to myself, I like you're saying, you can't really help but compare, a new work with the previous work and, with a sort of arc of an artist's entire body of work. And I think it's interesting because this book in many ways feels very different from Everything I Never Told You, but many of the sort of concerns and themes are very similar, just sort of approached in a different way, where both books are, very, you are talking about race in some way in both books. It's more foregrounded in the first one, but it's present in the second one. But also, so much of the first one, I connected so deeply with the racial aspects of the first book, but then, there are so many interesting things about family and about things like birth order and your like family role, like how you participate in your family in both books.
Yeah.
That I really wasn't thinking about as much the first time I read through Everything I Never Told You, but then in retrospect, having now read Little Fires Everywhere, that was present there as well, and that's a little more foregrounded in this one. And I don't know, I just think it's fascinating to see. I think, one of the things that's really interesting about art is, like I always say, what's great about art is that it's a communicative medium. And, people only make things because they have some impulse to sort of communicate something. Mm-hmm. And so, like, watching an artist sort of wrestle with the things that are important to them through their work, I find that you often, even when people end up going on to a new idea or concept, they're doing it in a way that still feels very much of a piece, oftentimes. Yeah. And I felt that very strongly with this book as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to experience it even, from the other side as the person who wrote these books. Theoretically, I would know what I'm wrestling with, but I don't always know exactly what's drawing me to the work until I'm well into it, and sometimes until it's done. And then I, like a reader, look at it and go, oh, I am really interested in an idea of, what is your kind of assigned role in the family? And are you ever able to break out of that role, right? Like, if you're going to be the troublemaker, if everyone thinks you're the troublemaker, can you ever not be the troublemaker? Are they ever going to be able to see you in that way, right? Or if you're always the favored one and you're the smart girl and you're, the one who's going to do all the things your parents want, are you ever able to sort of start that over? Can you ever step out of that role? And that's one of the things that I'm realizing that I've been interested in a lot of my work is, do you ever get to have a fresh start, or does that past and what people associate with you always come along with you? So in Everything I Never Told You, that's very, that's a lot of what's at heart in the parents' relationship, and the mother makes some decisions in which, you wonder, can she start over? Mm-hmm. Can she kind of make a clean break from the past and start doing something else? Can Lydia do that? Can any of the family members do that, right?
Yeah.
Or do those things just always stick to you and come with you? And then in Little Fires Everywhere, after, when you put out a book, you have to read it a number of times to edit it, and you go through it with different people, and then you have to read it again when it's copy edited, and then you have to read it again when it's typeset to proofread it, and you usually have to read it again because, you have to check and make sure everything you put in goes through. So at a certain point, like, there gets to be this very weird distance where there's this phenomenon called linguistic satiation, which is like, if you're a kid, you say the same word over and over and it loses all meaning. It's a little bit like that, where I think at a certain point you see the book often enough that you kind of lose all of your connection to it. And that has its pros and cons, but one of the things that happened to me in going through the editing process with this book is that now I feel like I've got a little bit of distance from it, and I can go, oh, I seem to be interested in this. I seem to be interested in that idea of, can you make a clean break with your past, or is that always going to be with you? Can you ever, step out of the family role and take on a different one? Or are you always going to be the person that, your family has decided that you are? And to see some of those parallels between that and Everything I Never Told You has been an interesting sort of like self-analysis exercise. But I know what you mean too about seeing with other artists, to seeing them, even when they're starting something very new, you see them approach it in a way that feels like them. I just finished reading George Saunders' debut novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, and I was trying to figure out before I started it what a George Saunders novel would look like, because I'm a fan of his work, but of course he's only written short stories as his fiction. And so to come to this work, which I don't know if you've read it, but is about Abraham Lincoln, the president, sort of grieving his son who's died, and his son's spirit is in this graveyard, and there are all these other kind of spirits and ghosts around it, and they're sort of fighting over whether to sort of push that spirit onwards or to kind of let him come back to kind of stick around and communicate with his father. And there's a lot more to it than that, but it was approached in such a uniquely George Saunders way that I was like, oh, I couldn't have figured it out before, but this is what a George Saunders novel might look like. And he's still approaching this totally new thing in a way that feels totally fresh and yet also feels exactly like what, a George Saunders novel would look like. It's kind of amazing to see those connections between, the work that he's done and then this new work.
Yeah, I have not read that book. I've been watching everybody talk about it, and it's definitely on my list, but I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm going to have to make time for it.
There's finite time and almost infinite books, but which is one of the sad things that I'm realizing. If I reread a book, I was like, oh, but I could have been reading a new book, but I want to reread this one.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because it's very piecemeal. Like it's told almost like a play. Like it's all in dialogue, and each of these spirits is talking, and they're kind of named. Like it's almost like in a play where you would say Hamlet, to be or not to be, and then the next person would respond, and there's a little tagline for each of them. And then the way that the story is put together through all of these different voices, there's something about it that felt very much like George Saunders. It's that feeling of inevitability, like, oh, it could only have come out this way.
So before we get too much further, I did want to sort of ask you to same thing with the new book, because I mentioned it and you mentioned, we talked about it a little bit, but sort of intro the book for the listeners.
It'd be good. Maybe I tell them what the book is about. So they would like to read. So the second novel is called Little Fires Everywhere, and it actually takes place in my hometown, which is Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland that is known for being very meticulously planned, very progressive, fairly affluent, and just sort of very, very green and very kind of like a nice place to live, sort of the idealized suburb. And it focuses on two families. One, the Richardsons, who live there, multi-generations of family living in this town, and kind of embody the spirit of that town. The idea that if you follow the rules, your life will come out well, and that'll be better for everybody. And then another family, a single mother and her daughter, come to town, and these two families get tangled up with each other and start causing some complications for each other. And when a white family in this town tries to adopt a Chinese American baby, it kind of splits the town, and it puts these two families on opposing sides. And that, of course, is when everything starts to fall apart for them. So that's sort of what the second book is about.
It was such a I read the book in 4 days, and the only reason that it took me that long is because I had to go to work. But I just found the whole thing just gripping and really I really just wanted to be in it the whole time. And again, one of the things that I love so much about this book and the other book, that this just goes back to the thing that we were talking about before about writing each character with so much sort of compassion, where, and this sort of, it was interesting. I was thinking about as I was reading it, that, wow, I love this book, and this is this is what I'm sort of taking away from it, is this idea or that idea or things like that. And I felt like a lot of things about some of the tensions in the between the characters were presented in a way that was very sort of subtle, and there were things that I sort of grasped about you never beat anybody over the head with issues exactly, but sort of present things in ways that, there are things in there that you nowadays would describe as microaggressions, but they're not really tagged that way.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, I wonder what it would be like to read this book if I just had a completely different experience of life.
I'm curious to see what the reaction will be from, people who've had really different experiences of life. But, one of the things that I wanted very much to do with this book, even when I started out, was, even though I had an idea from the beginning that certain characters were going to do certain things that would be kind of reprehensible, that I didn't want there to be any villains in the book, and I didn't also want there to be any heroes in the book, and I don't think that there are. I don't see any of these characters as either villains or heroes, and so part of that in writing it was to try and just portray each of them as a human being who, has motivations and wants and reasons for doing the things that they do, even when those things are actually kind of terrible, some of them,
Yeah. But you never really, it's interesting, the way that I felt reading it is, I felt that there was a thing you said a minute ago about, not making a moral judgment or something like that. I felt like, as I was reading this, and I was sort of putting myself or trying to put myself in your head, you, the author's head, as you were writing this, where I felt like, I feel like she has an opinion about this thing or that thing, but, and I think this is probably what her opinion on this is. I feel like you're never letting any of the characters off the hook exactly for the things that they do that are, as you would say, as you just put it, reprehensible. But also, I kind of feel like there's an opportunity where, because there's you get so much about each character's motivations and history, and there's such an opportunity to connect deeply with each of them, that if you were invested in a particular character in a certain way, that it might be it might be you how to put this, if I had grown up differently than how I grew up and connected with some of the characters that way. Oh shit, I'm really stumbling over myself right now.
Well, I have an idea of what you might be, so I can take a guess at it, and you can tell me if I'm moving in the right direction. The fact is that I did grow up with a lot of people who were like the family in the book, and I think my own family is like both of the families in this book in different ways. And, this is a book where definitely I feel like there is a significant part of me in each of the characters. And the best comparison I can come up with, I guess, is that I guess recently I did an interview with somebody from the Cleveland area, and they said, were you worried? Are you worried about how, people in your hometown or people in suburbs like it will respond to this book? Did you censor yourself in any way? And I said, well, I am worried about it because I wanted to get it right. And I love my hometown, and I wanted, I wanted to be accurate in what I was showing about it, but I wanted also to be honest about the sort of faults or blind spots that community has. And I said, the best comparison I have is if you were, making a portrait of some family member you want to be honest. You want to show them in, as they are, and show all of their good things. But you also maybe recognize that even as you love them and even as there are wonderful things about them, okay, you have these weird faults, or, you're the racist aunt, or you're very judgmental, or you're stingy, or whatever, whatever the faults are of the person that you love. You can hold both of those things in your head at the same time. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Whether I succeed or not, I guess, will sort of be in the judgment of the reader. But, I wanted to show all of the sort of good things and good intentions that, a community or a person might have, and also the ways in which they might fall short for reasons that are and are not their fault.
Yeah. It's, and, thinking about this book and how that was another thing that it was really obvious that this is, I didn't know specifically that you were from this town exactly, but I did look up, this is a real town, and, I was like, these are actually real streets in this town.
They're real streets.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And it's rendered in such there's a tenderness to it. I've made work about place and about home before, that there are the ways that you are rendering this community felt very sort of familiar to me. But it's always tricky when you want to sort of engage with a place in a way that gets it right, but that also allows you to express a feeling about it. It's a tricky thing. But
yeah, there's sort of a tricky middle distance that you need to be in, right?
Yeah.
Like when you are so familiar with something, a lot of times you can't see it clearly because it's too close to you, or it's too familiar, like, like your brain just doesn't notice a lot of things about it because you see it all the time. And yet, if you're too far away from it, then you don't see all of the details about it that kind of make it important and unique. And so there's sort of a weird middle distance that you have to inhabit, I think, in any kind of art that you're doing, to try and see both from that inside and from outside, right?
Yeah.
So that you're able to be honest, but also accurate, right? And then you can, and so again, I hope I got it right. I imagine there will be people who think I got it right, and then there are probably going to be people who feel that I didn't get it right. But, I guess maybe that's the challenge of writing or of art in general, is that you try the best you can to take a stab at it, and then you see what people make of it.
Yeah, it's always a little difficult to navigate that. Just sort of, I don't know. Everybody comes to a work with their own, their own baggage, the weight of their own experience, and view it through their own lens. So I don't know that it's one of the things that's so interesting to me about making work that's very specific, and especially if it's about a place, or, I guess you could even in some ways think of a family as a place.
Yeah.
But that, like, as I was making a series of photographs about my hometown, I approached it in a very particular way. And then as I was starting to show the work, I found that people who were not from my town tended to all see the same kinds of things in it, which were largely the things I was trying to communicate, the sort of emotions that I was trying to communicate. But people who are from that town often had very wildly different takes on an individual photograph, especially if it was of a very recognizable location.
Yeah.
That they would, like, some people had actually almost sort of violent emotional reactions to some of the pictures that I had, which were very different from the ones that I had.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't know, it's because, each one of them has their own memories associated with that place, which are very different from mine, even though we grew up in the same town. These are like my school classmates many times, so it's not like these people are strangers to me. But
well, and I think that's part of, what makes art so powerful is that, you may have an intent when you do the work, but the meaning that actually comes out of that, whether it's a photograph or a book or a poem or whatever it is, really comes when the person who's viewing the art or engaging with it in some way brings all of their experiences in, and it's that particular alchemy that comes out. Like I think about times that I've been in the art museum and I look at portraits and I think, okay, so I've got an opinion about what this person looks like. And then you read the little tag that says this, the sitter actually hated this portrait and never hung it, right? Or, things that they bring to it because they didn't like how it looked or they didn't like what it implied about them or all of these things. And yet when we look at it, may view it totally differently than the way that person did. Or I think about the ways that, if you think back to English class, you read a poem or you read a book and then somebody says, well, this is what I took from it. And then what you took from it is somewhat different than that. You all read the same words. And so clearly the different ingredient that's there is your experience and your interpretation of it. But it's like you said, it's interesting to see that people who are connected with those places just like you are have vastly different reactions, it sounds like, in both tone and scale than you had. Yeah.
And I've found that it can be a little complex to navigate that with these people. But, so far it's worked out more or less okay.
And that's the thing, too. I think that, you have, we have these ideas about how we see something. And a lot of times I'm surprised. I don't know why I'm surprised, but when other people feel threatened by the fact that you think about something in a different way than they do, right? Which it seems like it's not necessarily something to be scared of. And yet I kind of get that. This idea that maybe the world is not as you perceived it, or the feeling that somebody else is getting it wrong. I think this is some kind of human impulse, which is that we really, really hate to be misunderstood. And so the idea that if somebody's thinking something different than you are, then they must not understand it properly.
Yeah.
Right? That idea that we have, that we kind of want to be aligned and we want to see things in the same way, is such a powerful force. And I feel like is in some ways a little bit at odds with sort of what art ought to be doing. If art has a purpose, I feel like one of its purpose is probably not to get everyone to look in the same direction and interpret everything exactly the same way. But it's complicated when those are people who we know and that we care about, and we maybe, and who maybe care about us, to find that we're seeing things in very different ways than they are.
Yeah. Oh man, there are so many other things that I would love to, like questions I'd love to ask you about this book and things to talk about. But I think that we need to move into the second segment. So why don't we take a quick little break and then come back for that. So for the second segment, I always ask the guest to bring a topic of their own, and it can be anything that you want to talk about, whatever's on your mind, whatever you find interesting. So what would you like to talk about today?
So as you know, I was having some angst over what we should talk about, not because I couldn't think of something, but because I had too many things I wanted to talk about. So you probably saw yesterday that I was sort of crowdsourcing ideas on Twitter and like, what would you like me to talk about? And people were coming up with all sorts of things. They're like, talk about writing. And I was like, no, it can't be about writing. It has to be about something else. And they're like, well, talk about your writing process. I was like, no, that's also about writing. And then I said to my husband, like, okay, I'm going to do this podcast tomorrow. What should we talk about? And he just started throwing out random ideas to me, which I guess were things that I had been talking about or doing over the past time. And so I came up with wildly divergent topics. One of which is just sort of like hobbies that I have when I'm not writing, including that I used to have like a little sideline of making scale miniatures, which people seem to find fascinating on Twitter. And the other that my husband suggested was octopuses, which are something that I've recently become obsessed by.
Oh my gosh.
So I don't know if you want to talk about one or the other or both, or if we should just talk about miniature octopuses and call it a day.
I did not know. I'd seen some of your pictures of the miniatures before, but I did not know about the octopus thing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, this is one of those, it's like a the more you know moment, like you can imagine the little star coming across, that I used to have a real phobia of octopuses. I don't really have a lot of phobias, but I was really terrified of octopuses, and they made me just very physically uncomfortable. And so if we were at the aquarium or, wherever there was a picture of an octopus, I really just had to leave. I had to just go away from it. And so, you know, a couple years ago, I was in Oregon for a friend's wedding, and we went to the aquarium, and they had this, you know, Pacific octopus in the tank, and I couldn't go near it. And so my son and my husband went to go look at it, and it was, you know, squirming around in the tank, and I just had to go elsewhere and turn around so that I couldn't see it at all. And I don't know where this came from. I was not chased by an octopus as a child. I've never had any, you know, real experiences with octopuses. And I remember having this fear pretty far back because I think we're close to the same age. There was around the time that we were kids and would have been watching Sesame Street. There was a sketch that they did. You know, they often have footage of animals and then there's some music, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the point is just, watch this animal, watch this gibbon swinging around, watch this llama going to the dentist, whatever. And this one was an octopus. Do you not remember the llama going to the dentist?
No.
You gotta look this up. Just Google Sesame Street llama dentist. There's a song about this girl in New York who's taking her llama to the dentist, because the llama's dentist. Like, the llama is getting its teeth checked. Because why not? But, you know, I think it was just one of those kind of innocuous things. And it was just this octopus kind of, you know, like doing its octopus thing and swirling around. And I have a very vivid memory of seeing it on the TV and just being terrified and just running out of the room and not being able to come back until I was sure that the octopus was gone. And I don't usually have that kind of reaction to a lot of things. And so this octopus phobia had kind of been with me for some time. And I don't remember how I ended up sort of going public with it on Twitter, but I think somebody maybe posted a video of an octopus. I know that, you know, every now and then there are these octopus videos that get posted for some reason. And I think it was, my husband had seen it and he said, "Oh, did you see the video of the octopus that, like," I remember there were these, you know, people who were filming a crab. So it was just a crab on the beach, and they were filming the crab. And then an octopus ran out of the ocean, across the beach, grabbed the crab, and ran back into the ocean. Oh, and so they happened to catch it on film because they had been filming the crab. And I saw this video going around, and my husband came home and said, "Yeah, I didn't send you that video because I didn't think you'd like it." And I just went on this little rant where I went, no portion of this is okay. Like, the octopus cannot come out of the water. It has to stay in the water. Like, that is one of the rules. Like, that's not okay. And then it cannot have a plan. Like, it cannot plan to run across and grab the crab and go back in. And my husband helpfully goes, "Oh yeah, this octopus definitely had a plan. Like, it went right out, grabbed it, and came back." And I went on this little rant about octopuses and why that was absolutely not okay in any way. And then, because Twitter is a place full of helpful and mischievous souls, people started sending me all kinds of information about octopuses. So they would send me, like, gifs of octopuses, like, carrying little coconut shells so that if they were scared, they could hide in them, which was further evidence of octopuses having plans. And somebody sent me an article from Orion magazine about octopuses, in which I learned all kinds of other really alarming things about them, that, like, you know, yes, they can actually survive out of the water for a certain amount of time, and that they can squeeze their bodies through extremely small openings, and that they're very smart, so that, like, if you put them in a jar, they can unscrew it from the inside, and, you know, they like to do puzzles, and so they're very difficult to work with in aquariums and labs because they're really smart and they keep trying to escape. And so, again, I was like, no, none of this is okay. Like, I am not at all okay with any of this. Like, if octopuses can get out of the water, then you don't know that there isn't an octopus, like, in the room with you. Like, there could be an octopus somewhere in your room. You just wouldn't know about it. And so Twitter somehow ended up being this sort of, like, I can't remember what they call it when like you're scared of snakes, and so people just keep, like, waving snakes in front of you, but, like, basically, like, to shock you out of being afraid of them. But the real turning point came when someone, and I still don't know who it was, sent a book about octopuses by Cy Montgomery called The Soul of an Octopus to our house around Christmas time, and I would think it would be a relative or friend, but no one has admitted to sending this book. And it felt like this sort of cruel joke that, I'm terrified of octopuses, and this book about octopuses arrived on our doorstep anonymously. The book actually has a picture of an octopus in the corner, and so if you flip the pages like a flip book, you can see the octopus swimming around. And so my husband read the book, and then I finally decided, okay, I'm actually going to read the book, and that book kind of turned me from an octopus fearer into like an octopus admirer. I still think they're super creepy, but now I kind of like begrudgingly admire all of the weird things that they can do. And now that my friends know this about me, they kind of gleefully send me any octopus-related news. And as I'm talking to you, I have this in front of me, this little glass octopus that a friend gave me. I think it's just a paperweight, but it's made out of glass, and it's that sort of Murano, like speckled. It's got little eyes, it's got little legs, and it apparently glows in the dark. Although I've actually not tested that. So, the octopus phobia thing is something that now I've become kind of obsessed with octopuses. And we go to the New England Aquarium, and I spend a lot of time looking at the octopus.
Wow.
That was less of a conversation and more of a little, my TED Talk on how I overcame my fear of octopuses.
I think octopuses are pretty fascinating. I don't know if you know this, but I actually, I worked for 2 summers at the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
You did? That's so cool.
Yeah, actually, do you know Lindsay Hatton?
She's a neighbor and a friend of mine.
Yeah, we actually worked there at the same time when we were in high school one summer. That's actually how I came to talk to her for the show and find out about her book. Somebody on Twitter, another author that I follow was talking about her book, and I was like, wait, that name sounds really familiar. And
that's so old.
Yeah, it's such a strange thing how small the world is sometimes. But so we're from the same area, and we both worked at the aquarium one summer. That summer was when we were in high school, and then I came back and did an internship when I was in college, and it was one of the things that I remember most about it was because when we did the internship, it was just doing like presentations for the visitors. We'd do little like sketches and plays and presentations and, to educational stuff to, talk about the exhibits or whatever. But they would also, because it was an internship, that there was a bunch of job shadow stuff that we would do on our off shifts, and getting to follow around the aquarists and learn about how they put an exhibit together and stuff. The one that really, really stood out to me was when they took us behind the octopus exhibits, and they were letting us like feed these octopuses, and it was really weird. Those are the only tanks that they put a padlock on. They have a permanent lid with a padlock that has a key and not a, for exactly the reason you were saying.
I love the idea, and reading about how, what escape artists that octopuses are is kind of, it's amazing and also, really, really terrifying. I would like to put on the record that I have never eaten octopus, so that when the octopuses take over the world and become our cephalopod overlords, I would just like them to know that I never ate any of their kind.
Yeah.
So they can take that into account when they're deciding what to do with all of us humans.
Yeah, I actually quit. I mean, octopus is a pretty common Japanese food.
The Chinese eat their share of octopuses as well.
Yeah, I quit eating octopus a few years ago just because it got a little too weird thinking about how smart they are.
Yeah, and it's not really dependent on size either. And so I think about those the very, very small octopus that you get the whole thing in soup and things like that, and it's unnerving. So
yeah, it's I don't know. It was interesting. I remember the aquarist talking about, here you can feed this octopus. This is how you do it, and the octopus sort of reaching out of the tank to get the little bits of food that we were giving it, and you'd sort of stroke these little bits of fish along its suckers because that's where their olfactory.
Right, they're tasting, right, with their suckers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then as you would do that, it would also sort of start touching you as well, as just sort of exploring you. And it was a little, like, it was kind of exciting and kind of unnerving at the same time, because like they're very curious, and you kind of get the sense that they actually have like a personality almost.
Yeah.
It's not quite like interacting with another kind of animal. Like it feels a lot more purposeful sometimes. And that's why I can't eat them anymore.
Yeah, I mean, so reading this book, The Soul of an Octopus, and other things that I have now read about octopuses, because people helpfully keep sending these things to me. They talk about how sometimes the octopuses will, they develop an antipathy towards certain people, and so they can squirt water, and so sometimes they will like deliberately squirt people that they don't like, and there's stories about people who, people at the aquariums who the octopus really hated would soak them every time. They leave and get another job. They come back after a period of years. The octopus sees them. First thing they do is squirt them again. Right? Like there's that sense that like this animal remembers things and does, in fact, like it's very purposeful in what it does, which is, again, amazing and scary at the same time. What does it feel like when the octopus is kind of like exploring your arm?
Well, I sort of just froze up and just sort of let it happen, so it's not like I was trying to get away from it or anything. I think I was a little freaked out. But it was, wet and kind of surprisingly gentle. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to describe it. But the sense that I came away with most was just like, this is like you say, purposeful. There's an intention behind this, and it just felt like you were interacting with something that understood what was happening, And
it's so interesting because I think we have this mental hierarchy of creatures, right? So we would expect that maybe from a monkey or an ape, right? We would expect that from an elephant or a dog or a cat. And then when we move into the invertebrates, we don't really expect that at all, right? Like it's, we expect certain kinds of interaction from a fish, but we don't imbue them with that kind of consciousness and, purpose to their actions. And so I wonder if that's part of the reason that we think of them as being reactive, and yet here's this creature that's actually super smart.
Yeah. I mean, that was one thing when, you spend 2 summers in an aquarium, you kind of realize something like most fish are really, really dumb. Like there's not anything going on in there, but so the octopus really, I think that's why it stood out to me so much of all my memories of that job, because it's a really striking difference. I read somewhere somebody speculating that, or I don't know if it was like a marine scientist or something, that was saying, I think he was sort of half joking that like, yes, they're very smart, and like the only reason that they don't take over the whole world is because they only live a few years. Which I guess if you have a phobia is not like the most useful thing to be talking about.
No, it's not, but it's now I feel like this is one of the few phobias that I've had, and I feel like it's now mostly dissipated. Like we went to the aquarium, and I was the one who was bringing my son over to the octopus, and we stayed there for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And we talked to the zoologist who was there and looked at it, and I don't think I'm at the point where I would like touch one or like go into the water with one.
Yeah.
But I'm at least at the stage where I'm sort of fascinated by them rather than repulsed and horrified. And I have to say it's much better on this side.
Yeah. Even compared to other cephalopods, they're very, like, because there were, squid and cuttlefish and nautiluses and stuff in the aquarium as well. But the interaction with octopus is very different from those. And
Do you remember the name of the octopus that you interacted with?
No,
I'm just curious.
it had a name, but I don't remember. The species was a giant red octopus, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't remember its name.
Very cool.
Gosh, there was something else that I just thought of as well, and I can't remember what it was. Oh well.
Sorry, it's because I interrupted you to ask you about octopus names. That's why. Well, I learned, we were at the aquarium and my son said, does this octopus have a name? And I said, it probably does. So we asked, and the octopus there are two, but the one we were looking at the New England Aquarium is currently named Cy, after this biologist, Cy Montgomery, who wrote the octopus book that someone sent me anonymously in the mail. And so I went, oh, this has come full circle. That, we're now looking at an octopus named after the person who wrote that book. And it's sort of a fun thing.
Yeah, I remember what it was. It was thinking about octopus nervous systems and how different they are from like mammal nervous systems.
Yeah.
That if these things really do think, if they have cognition in a way that we would recognize, that like their brains and their nervous systems are so different that they would think in ways that would be really different from how we think. And sort of well, I mean, like for one thing, like their brains are distributed around their bodies, so like they have.
Oh, that's so weird.
Yeah, right. Like they're like each tentacle has essentially like a mini brain in it, and so that like just that structure, of having sort of a whole bunch of mini brains distributed around your body, but also working in connection with each other, you'd think so that should lead to. If they have cognition, that it would be like very different, just the pathways that they use would have to be very different. And I don't know, I think there's something kind of, I want to say like awesome, but like awesome in like the awe-inspiring kind of way.
Right.
Thinking about that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I didn't know that about their brains. I heard something about them on the radio recently as well, where they were talking about how they can regrow some of their limbs. So like if they lose an arm or leg, they can regrow another one. It just takes like about 2 months for it to regrow. And so they were saying, we don't know exactly how many legs it can lose before, its function is impaired enough that it might not live long enough to regrow the leg. But they said, in the wild, we've seen octopuses get down to one leg and then still be able to regrow them. And I was just, for some reason, thinking about if that made the octopus sort of like conceive of its body and its sense of self differently. If you know that thing can go away, but you can make another one, like how does that affect how it thinks of itself? If the octopus, in fact, is even thinking about itself in that way.
Yeah.
So different from how we are. So
weird. That reminds me, there was this thing, there's a science fiction novel that's called Blind Sight by Peter Watts. That, well, first of all, when I read this book, it put me into sort of this weird existential tailspin that, like, I don't know if I necessarily would recommend. But certainly a bunch of my sort of sci-fi friends were really into it. It's an interesting book in a lot of ways, but one of the things that it was sort of positing was, an alien species of separating consciousness from intelligence, and talking about how a bunch of different animal species that they recognize as being very intelligent, oftentimes the more intelligent ones have less of a concept of self as far as we're able to determine. And he was sort of playing with that idea with these aliens that apparently he modeled after, like their physiology was modeled after brittle stars, which also, tentacles and everything. Yeah. But it kind of makes me wonder, like, if octopuses are very smart, if that necessarily means that they're aware of themselves in a way. But then there are other experiments, like, I don't know, I remember an experiment that some scientists were doing with, I think, magpies, where they were doing these experiments with mirrors and things like that, where it seemed pretty clear that the magpie was aware of itself.
Right, yeah.
As separate from what it was seeing. I thought, some of the things that these I don't know, animal psychologists or whatever come up with, it really, I don't know about what it does for anybody else. For me, it really makes me, it makes me feel very like, I don't know, I almost get these sensations of being dissociated.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It's like, I remember reading a while ago about, they do this mirror test, like with, chimps and elephants, and there's only certain animals that, like, again, you say they put them in front of a mirror and they put a mark on them and they see whether the animal reaches towards the mirror to try and wipe off the mark, or they reach towards their own head to try and wipe off, that mark. So that's one of the ways of testing what their sense of self is. And it's very odd because, of course, we're like, okay, so in our human sense of self, if I put, a mark on your forehead and then you look at the mirror and you try and wipe it off of the mirror, you don't have the same kind of sense of self that we have because you don't recognize that that's you. But it might be that they have a whole different way of just conceiving of themselves, which is kind of a fascinating idea.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So octopuses is what we settled on. So.
Yeah. No, that was great.
Yeah. So now, many people, I'm sure, will then be sending me like a lot more information about octopuses. So I welcome your information about octopuses now. No longer afraid. I am now interested and slightly afraid.
So the last question that I like to ask everyone is whether there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Oh, I mean, there have been so many. I'm trying to think of ones that I haven't just talked about. Well, I've been finding myself turning to poetry a lot in the past few months. I've still been reading fiction, and I'm still reading plenty of other things, but I've been finding sort of a new resonance in poetry, maybe because it's this very sort of like distilled idea, and also because I kind of started off thinking I wanted to be a poet and realizing that was not one of my strengths, and so I still kind of always sort of admire and envy poets. But I've started making just like a little collection for myself of poems that I can turn to read when I'm feeling low, or not even necessarily low, but I need sort of like an injection of something to kind of get me thinking and feeling. And so I've got a whole bunch of them, but one that I always think about is called The Orange by Wendy Cope. Which is a poem, so if you're listening, you can go and Google the poem, The Orange, Wendy Cope, Cope. But essentially sort of is, for me, about finding these sort of small moments of joy and beauty in the world that kind of allow you to keep going and kind of continuing, and sort of like just those moments where they don't have any particular big meaning, but they just remind you what it is to be alive. The poem for me has been a nice reminder. And so, as you can infer, there is an orange in the poem. And so I often think about that when I'm eating an orange. I always think of this poem now that I've read it, whenever I'm eating an orange and thinking about those small moments of joy.
Yeah.
So that's
great. I really love work like that, whether it's poetry or photographs or whatever, that I find in my own work I'm very drawn to details, and often I respond very strongly to different works that are sort of finding the beauty in very mundane things. So yeah, I'll have to check that out. That's great. I'll find it. I'll put a link in the show notes. So
perfect.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed it, and I'm so glad to have had the opportunity. I've been a fan for so long. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and it's nice to get to talk to you with my voice as opposed to just on Twitter. I was like, talk to you in words. No, we use words on Twitter. Yeah. But it's nice to connect with you, and thank you for having me on the podcast. I really had fun talking to you.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, Celeste is launching a 27-city book tour this week. Over the next week, she will be in Brooklyn at Greenlight Bookstore on September 13th, in Washington, D.C. at Politics and Prose on September 14th, in Baltimore at Ivy Bookshop on September 15th, and in Stonington, Connecticut at Wheeler Library on September 16th. And then after that, she's got 22 more stops on her tour. So obviously come say hi, buy her book, but also be nice. I'm sure all that traveling has got to be a little exhausting. For a full list of tour dates and times, go to celesteing.com/events, and there's a link in the show notes for that. Now, as for that giveaway, so as I mentioned, I'm giving away 2 books to one lucky listener, a trade paperback of Everything I Never Told You, and a signed hardcover edition of the new book, Little Fires Everywhere. If you want to be eligible for the drawing, here's what you do. Go to keepthechanneleopen.com/connect, or just click the newsletter link right here in your podcast app. It's in the notes under the Connect section. Subscribe to the KTCO newsletter, and then just send me a quick email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com letting me know that you'd like to enter the giveaway. Got that? So it's subscribe to the newsletter, then send me an email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com and let me know you'd like to enter. And I'll be doing the drawing 1 week from today. That will be Wednesday, September 20th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And I'll announce the winner on Twitter. And, don't worry, if you don't follow the show on Twitter, I'll also contact you by email. And that is our show. If you'd like to, you can follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you'd like to help support the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That really does help the show. There's a link in the show notes for that. Actually, just in general, if you like a podcast, any podcast, not even this podcast, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's really great. It helps. And if you really, really want to support this show, you can also subscribe to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's patreon.com/sakeriver, sake like the drink and river like river. And just $1 a month, and you can get access to every episode a day early, and it goes a long way toward making the show possible. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time, our guest will be poet Maggie Smith, so be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.